In the 1940s, more than 2 million Black Americans carried their midday meal to work in a tin pail or a folded square of wax paper. Domestic workers, porters, mill hands, sharecroppers, school teachers. The lunchbox was the one place a family could still control what went into the day. Number 22 on this list could survive a 10-hour shift in a steel plant without a fridge. Number 15 fed 3 children for a single dime. Number 4 on this list was wrapped so carefully it became its own kind of prayer. These meals were not built for trends. They were built so a working body could keep moving and a working mind could remember home. Now, hit subscribe and unwrap the wax paper because here are 30 African American lunchbox meals no one makes anymore. Number 30, cold hoe cake with cane syrup. This was the meal that traveled best because it did not need a fork or a plate or a friend nearby. A hoe cake was cornmeal, water, salt, and a spoon of lard poured onto a hot griddle until the edges crisped. Mothers baked them at 4 in the morning, wrapped them in a clean flour sack, and tucked a small jar of cane syrup into the side of the pail. By noon, the cake was cold and a little tough, and the syrup had soaked into the crumb. Field hands ate it standing up. School children broke off pieces under a tree. It was the same recipe enslaved cooks had carried into freedom, almost unchanged since the 1860s, and it filled a working stomach for a price that came out to roughly 2 cents a serving in 1942. Number 29, salt pork and biscuit pocket. Domestic workers in Atlanta and Birmingham swore by this one because it kept for 10 hours without spoiling. A thick buttermilk biscuit was split in half, the inside hollowed out with a thumb, and a thin slice of fried salt pork was tucked into the pocket. The grease soaked the bread from the inside out, which sealed it against the heat of a streetcar ride. Some women added a smear of yellow mustard, others a pinch of black pepper, nothing more than that. The whole thing was wrapped in wax paper and pressed flat under a heavier item in the pail so the pocket would hold its shape. A laundry worker could eat it one-handed while still feeding sheets through a wringer. The salt pork cost about 8 cents a pound at the neighborhood grocery in 1945, and one strip stretched across 3 days of lunches if you sliced it thin. Number 28, cold fried chicken wing. Before fried chicken became a restaurant icon, it was the most reliable thing a Black mother could pack for a child or a husband. The wing was the cheapest piece, costing about 3 cents a piece at a neighborhood grocery in 1948, and the bone gave the meat enough structure to survive a long ride. Wings were fried the night before in a heavy skillet, drained on butcher paper, and left uncovered overnight so the crust would set hard. By morning, the skin was crackling cold. The wing went into the pail alongside a slice of cornbread, and the grease that bled through the wax paper actually made the bread taste better. Number 27, the cane syrup sandwich. When there was no meat in the icebox and no money for cheese, this was what kept children from going to school hungry. 2 slices of soft white bread, a thick pour of dark cane syrup or sorghum across the middle, and the whole thing pressed flat so the syrup would not run. By the time the child opened the wax paper at recess, the bread had absorbed the syrup and gone slightly leathery, which is exactly what made it last. Tenant farm families in Mississippi and Alabama lived on these in the spring of 1937, when the planter's commissary was the only place to buy food and molasses cost a dime a quart. It was sweet enough to feel like a treat. It was also dinner. Number 26, the whole baked sweet potato. A working woman would slide a sweet potato into the oven at 5 in the morning, let it bake while she dressed her children, and drop it into her pail still warm in its skin. By midday, it was room temperature, and the inside had turned dense and almost candied. There was no need for butter or sugar because a properly baked sweet potato made its own. Sharecropper families grew them on the edges of cotton rows, because the vines did not interfere with the crop, and a single potato could feed a grown person through an afternoon of picking. Eaten with the fingers, peeled back like a banana with the skin, tossed under a tree for the chickens. Number 25, 2 hard-boiled eggs with black pepper. This was the lunch of railroad maids and Pullman car cleaners, women who needed something they could eat fast in a service closet between stops. Eggs were boiled in a pot the night before with a splash of vinegar to make the shells easier to peel, then dried on a clean towel and dropped into the pail still warm in the morning. A twist of newspaper held a teaspoon of salt, and another twist held coarse black pepper, and the woman would crack the egg against the metal pail, peel it into her hand, and dip it as she ate. 2 eggs cost roughly 4 cents at a neighborhood grocery in 1944, and a dozen lasted a working woman almost a full week. They held off hunger for hours. They left no smell on the breath, which mattered when the next passenger was waiting at the door with a question and a tip in his hand. Number 24, leftover greens packed in a jelly jar. Working mothers in the Black Belt knew that a jar of yesterday's collards was a complete lunch if you packed it right. The greens were cooked down on Sunday with a knuckle of fatback and a splash of cider vinegar, and what was left over got spooned into a clean ball jar with a wedge of cornbread balanced on top to soak up the potlikker. By noon, the cornbread had absorbed the salty green broth, and the whole thing tasted better than it had the night before. A textile worker in North Carolina would eat it cold with a spoon, leaning against the loading dock, and the cornbread bottom would be the last and best bite. The jar went home empty and got rinsed for tomorrow. Number 23, cold buttermilk poured over crumbled cornbread. This one went into a tin cup with a tight lid, not a pail, because it was a meal you drank as much as you ate. A piece of day-old cornbread was crumbled into the cup. The buttermilk was poured over until it just covered the crumbs, and the lid was pressed on hard so nothing would slosh on the walk to work. By noon, the bread had swollen into a thick porridge, sour and cool from the buttermilk. A dirt farmer in the Arkansas Delta could drink the whole cup in 3 long pulls and be back behind the mule before his shadow moved. Number 22, the smoked neck bone and rice ball. This is the meal a steel worker in Gary or Birmingham could carry into a 10-hour shift with no icebox, no canteen, and no way to warm anything up at the plant. The neck bone came from the smokehouse, salt cured for weeks until the meat was almost dry to the touch, and the rice was cooked the night before in the broth that the neck bone had given up while it simmered. The two were pressed together while still warm into a ball about the size of a fist, then wrapped in 2 layers of wax paper and tied off with butcher string. By the time the man clocked in at 6 in the morning, the ball had cooled and tightened into something that would not fall apart no matter how hard the pail bounced against his thigh on the walk in. At lunch, he would untie the string, peel back the paper, and eat the whole thing in his hand while the blast furnace roared behind him and his crew sat in a half circle on the loading dock. The smoke from the cure kept the meat from spoiling through the heat of the morning. The salt held everything together when nothing else could. The rice carried him through the afternoon when the heat off the furnace made fresh bread go sour in under an hour. Steel workers in Pittsburgh and Gary lived on this meal from the late 30s through the early 60s, and the men who could not afford a thermos preferred it to anything hot because it never let them down and never embarrassed them in front of the white foreman. A neck bone cost about 6 cents at the neighborhood butcher in 1948, and a cup of long grain rice cost less than a nickel. Together, they made a lunch that fed a grown working man for an entire day. It was the meal that did not need a refrigerator and did not ask for one. It was built for a body that did not get to sit down until the whistle blew. Number 21, a tea cake folded into the napkin. African American mothers had been making tea cakes since before emancipation, and the recipe survived because it asked for almost nothing from the pantry: flour, lard, a little sugar or molasses if the family had any, an egg if there was one to spare, all baked into a soft round cookie the size of a small saucer. 2 of them went into the lunch pail, wrapped in a square of clean muslin, one for the worker and one for whoever asked first when he got home. The cake did not crumble. It did not melt in the heat. It did not need to be eaten with anything else. A Pullman porter on the Illinois Central in 1939 could slip one out of his vest pocket between stations and finish it before the next passenger looked up. The tea cake had carried black families through Juneteenth picnics for 70 years, and it was carrying them through the working day too. Number 20, cold roasted yam with raw onion. This one came out of the Carolina Low Country and stayed in the lunch pails of Gullah women working in Charleston households well into the 1950s. The yam was roasted whole in the ashes the night before, peeled at dawn, and sliced thick. A raw onion was sliced into rounds beside it, and both went into the pail with a small square of cured ham if the household had any. The combination of the sweet cold yam and the sharp onion was enough to wake a tired woman up by the time she sat down on her break. It cost almost nothing because the yam came from the back garden and the onion came from a bin in the pantry. 3 slices of each, wax paper between them so the flavors did not bleed. Number 19, a biscuit fried in yesterday's bacon grease. Nothing was wasted in a working black household, and the bacon grease in the can on the stove was the most valuable thing in the kitchen. A leftover biscuit was split, pressed cut side down into a hot skillet with a spoonful of that grease, and crisped on both sides until the bread tasted like meat. 2 of them went into the pail wrapped in newsprint, and the grease soaked through and stained the paper dark by noon. Cotton field workers in the Mississippi Delta ate them between rows. The biscuit was already a leftover, and the grease was already paid for, which made the whole lunch effectively free. Number 18, a single pickled pig's foot in wax paper. The pickling jar lived on the back porch year-round, and a working man could fish one out at 5 in the morning and have his lunch ready in under a minute. The vinegar and salt had cured the foot for weeks, which meant it could sit in a hot lunch pail all day without turning. The man would unwrap it at noon, eat the meat off the bone with his fingers, and use the gelatin around the joint to coat a piece of bread he had packed alongside. It was salty enough to make him drink water, which kept him hydrated through an afternoon of heavy work. Pig's feet cost a nickel apiece at the neighborhood butcher in 1943. Number 17, cornbread soaked in potlikker. Potlikker was the salty green broth left in the pot after a long Sunday simmer of collards or turnip greens, and no black household with sense ever threw it out. It went into a glass jar with a tight lid, and a wedge of cornbread went on top to drink it up overnight. By morning, the cornbread had turned into a salty, vitamin-heavy sponge, and the jar went into the pail with a spoon tied to the side by a string. Doctors in the rural South had been quietly telling women for decades that potlikker kept babies healthy through the winter, and a working mother could feed herself the same way, one spoonful at a time, leaning against a wall on her 10-minute break. Number 16, bologna and yellow mustard on soft white bread. By the late 1940s, even the poorest black household in Memphis or Detroit could afford a pack of bologna once a week, and the sandwich it made became the standard issue lunch for school-aged children. 2 thin slices of bologna, a smear of bright yellow mustard, 2 pieces of squishy white bread pressed flat, It went into the pail in wax paper with the crust cut off if the mother had time and on if she did not. A child could trade half of it on the playground for a tea cake or a piece of fruit, and nobody ever turned it down. Number 15, leftover rice and red beans spooned into a jelly jar. This was the lunch that fed 3 children for a single dime because a pound of dried red beans cost about 9 cents at the neighborhood grocery in 1942, and a cup of rice cost less. The beans were cooked Sunday with a ham hock the family had already used twice, and the rice was whatever was left in the pot from supper. 2 heaping spoonfuls of each went into a clean jelly jar with a wedge of cornbread sealed across the top, and the jar got tied into a flour sack with the spoon. A mother in Houston or Mobile would split 1 jar between 3 children at the schoolyard fence, and every child tipped the jar straight up to catch the bean liquor. Nobody walked away hungry. Number 14, a fried apple ham pie folded into a square of newspaper. Late summer through October, the apple barrel on the back porch was the most generous thing in a black household, and a working mother turned the bruised fruit into hand pies before the cold set in. A round of biscuit dough was rolled thin, a spoonful of stewed cinnamon apple was dropped in the center, and the dough was folded into a half moon and crimped with a fork. It went into a hot skillet of lard until the outside was deep brown and blistered. 2 of these went into the lunch pail wrapped in newsprint, and the grease soaked through and made the paper translucent by noon. A textile worker in Greensboro could eat one in 5 bites between looms. Number 13, liver pudding spread on saltine crackers. In the Piedmont mill towns of North Carolina, the neighborhood butcher sold a coarse peppery liver pudding by the slice for less than a nickel a pound, and it was the cheapest protein a black household could buy. A working man would press a thick smear of cold liver pudding onto a saltine, top it with a second cracker, and stack 4 or 5 of these sandwiches in a square of wax paper. The pudding firmed up overnight in the icebox, which meant it would not slide out between the crackers no matter how the pail rocked on the morning bus. It was salty enough to keep a man drinking water all afternoon, and it carried him through the second shift without a slump. Number 12, a thick square of crackling cornbread. Whenever a hog was killed, the rendered fat left behind hard, crisp bits called cracklings, and no black household ever let them go to waste. The cracklings were folded into a heavy cornmeal batter and baked in a deep pan until the top was nearly black, and the next morning, a thick square went into the lunch pail wrapped in wax paper. The cracklings kept the bread moist for hours, and the salt in the pork fat preserved it through the heat of a July afternoon. Sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta carried squares like this into the field at 6 in the morning and ate them standing in a row at the end of a row. 1 square was a full meal on its own. Number 11, a cold buttermilk biscuit split and filled with sorghum. The sorghum jug sat on the kitchen table in tenant farm households across Tennessee and Kentucky, and a mother could fix this lunch in under a minute on her way out the door. The biscuit was baked the night before, split with the side of a knife in the morning, and a slow pour of dark sorghum was let to soak into the cut sides. Pressed back together, wrapped tight in wax paper, it traveled in the pail without leaking a drop. Tobacco workers in the bright leaf belt ate them between rows. The sweetness was honest and almost mineral, nothing like syrup, and a single biscuit could keep a working body even through the long row of an afternoon. Number 10, a strip of smoked herring laid across a slab of cornbread. Smoked herring came packed in salt in wooden boxes at the neighborhood grocery for about 12 cents a pound in 1946, and a single fish could be stretched across 4 lunches. The herring was soaked in a bowl of water overnight to pull out the worst of the salt, then patted dry and laid across a thick slab of cold cornbread. The whole thing was wrapped in 2 layers of wax paper because the smell would otherwise climb out of the pail. A dock worker in Norfolk or Charleston ate it standing up on a piling at noon, and the salt in the fish made the cornbread taste like it had been baked twice. Number 9, a small jar of chicken foot broth with rice. Chicken feet cost almost nothing at the neighborhood butcher, sometimes a penny apiece in 1939, and a black household with a few hens out back paid nothing at all. The feet were simmered for hours with onion skins, a bay leaf if there was one, and a heavy hand of salt until the broth turned gold and gelatinous. A working woman would pour the hot broth over a spoon of rice in a glass jar, screw the lid down while it was still steaming, and tuck the jar inside a folded towel in her pail. By noon, the broth had set into a soft, savory jelly that loosened as she ate it with a spoon. Hospital cleaning crews in St. Louis and Chicago lived on this lunch through the war years, and a nurse on the same floor would sometimes ask what was in the jar because it smelled like home. Number 8, a small tin of sardines tipped onto a wedge of soda bread. A flat tin of sardines packed in mustard or oil cost a dime at the neighborhood grocery in 1944, and the can opener key was already attached. A working man would peel back the lid at noon, lay the fish across a thick wedge of soda bread the mother had baked Sunday, and fold the bread over the top. The oil soaked into the bread, and the mustard cut the richness of the fish. Pullman porters carried this lunch on long routes because the can sealed itself against the heat, and a porter could finish the whole thing in a service closet between stops. The empty tin went back into the pail and got rinsed out at home for a future pinch of nails. Number 7, a cold pork chop pressed between 2 slices of soft white bread. Pork chops were the Sunday meal in a black household with a working father, and the smallest chop in the pan was set aside before anyone reached for seconds because that one was tomorrow's lunch. The chop was fried in the morning skillet with a little flour and black pepper, drained on butcher paper and pressed flat between 2 slices of light bread the next morning. The grease and the seasoning soaked into the bread by noon, and the bone was eaten last like a treat. Auto plant workers in Detroit and Flint took these into the line through the late 40s, and a man could finish his sandwich and his coffee in the 10 minutes the foreman gave him before the conveyor started back up. Number 6, peach preserves and a slab of cream cheese on soft bread. When the summer peach crop came in, a working mother would put up a dozen jars of preserves on the back porch, and one of those jars carried a family through the entire fall lunch season. A thick slice of cream cheese cut from the brick that came wrapped in foil at the neighborhood grocery was laid across a slice of soft bread and topped with a heavy spoon of dark peach preserves. The second slice went on top, and the sandwich was pressed flat under the weight of the pail. By noon, the preserves had bled into the bread, and the cream cheese had softened against the heat of the streetcar window. A school teacher in Macon or Columbia could eat one between classes without staining her blouse. Number 5, a slice of cold souse meat on saltine crackers. Souse meat was the pressed, vinegar-cured head cheese the neighborhood butcher made every Friday from the parts no white household would buy, and it sold for under 20 cents a pound in 1947. A thin slice of sauce laid across a saltine was salty enough and acidic enough to keep through any heat, and a stack of 4 or 5 of these went into the lunch pail in wax paper. The vinegar bit the back of the throat in a way that woke a tired worker up by the first cracker. Bricklayers and roofers in Birmingham and Atlanta ate them on the edge of a half-built wall at noon, and the empty wax paper went into a back pocket to be reused for the next morning's lunch. Number 4, the shoebox lunch. Wrapped so carefully it became its own kind of prayer, this was the lunch a black mother packed for a child traveling north under Jim Crow. Because the dining car would not serve a black passenger and the segregated waiting rooms had no food at all, the shoebox was the only meal that child would eat between Memphis and Chicago. 2 pieces of cold fried chicken were wrapped first in wax paper, then in a clean dish towel that had been ironed the night before. A wedge of pound cake went into a separate paper square so the grease would not stain it. A hard-boiled egg, a twist of salt, sometimes a slice of cheese, sometimes an apple. The lid was tied down with kitchen string in a careful bow, and the bow was the part the child remembered. Shoebox lunches carried black travelers up the Illinois Central and the Southern Crescent from the 1920s through the early 1960s, and the same hands that packed them had packed the Sunday school dinner and the church revival supper. It was a meal made of love and refusal, and it did not need to be anything else. Number 3, pimento cheese spread thick on slices of soft wheat bread. Pimento cheese was a Saturday afternoon job in a working black household, made by grating a half-pound of sharp yellow cheese, stirring in a spoon of mayonnaise, and folding in a small jar of red pimento peppers chopped fine. A working mother would spread it thick on 2 slices of wheat bread, press the sandwich flat under a plate overnight in the icebox, and slip it into her pail in the morning. The bread softened against the spread, and the pimento bled a faint pink stain into the crust. Telephone operators in Richmond and Norfolk ate these between switchboard shifts, and the sandwich kept clean and quiet on a hot afternoon. The empty jar was rinsed and saved for the next batch of preserves. Number 2, last night's Brunswick stew sealed into a mason jar. Brunswick stew was the Sunday community pot in much of Black Georgia and the Carolinas, simmered all afternoon with whatever the household had: a piece of stewing hen, a knob of smoked pork, butter beans, corn off the cob, a few halved tomatoes from the back garden. What was left at the bottom of the pot got ladled into clean mason jars. While still hot, the lids screwed down tight and the jars set on the windowsill to cool. By Monday morning, the stew had thickened into something between a soup and a hash, and the jar slid into a working pail wrapped in a square of dish towel. Mill workers in Augusta or Columbia could open the jar at noon and eat straight from it with a spoon, and the stew tasted better cold than it had hot the night before. Number 1, a wedge of cornbread, a raw onion, and a tin cup of cold black coffee. This is the lunch that fed Blackfield hands across the Cotton South for the better part of a century, and it never asked for more than what was already in the kitchen. A wedge of last night's cornbread went into the pail wrapped in newsprint. A small white onion went in beside it, peeled and whole. The coffee was poured from the breakfast pot into a tin cup with a tight lid, sweetened with a thumb of sorghum if the household had any. At noon, the worker leaned against a fence post, bit the onion like an apple, followed it with cornbread, and chased both with a long pull of cold coffee. It carried a working people through generations of fields and factories and mills, all the way to a country that did not yet know how to thank them.
Hot water cornbread with molasses was the taste of country simplicity, fried golden and dipped in sweetness. Cornmeal mixed with boiling water formed quick patties, cooked in hot grease until crisp on the outside and soft within. Drizzled with molasses, it was a meal that straddled breakfast and lunch, satisfying both hunger and memory. It was quick to make, filling and rich with flavor. Field hands packed it in cloth wraps. Children ate it warm off the stove. It was humble food but deeply loved, proof that care could turn the plainest pantry into a feast. Each bite carried history, from wooden spoons to cast iron pans. Hot water cornbread with molasses was simplicity perfected, the golden taste of home that never needed more than what it already had. Stuffed collard rolls were an inventive lunch that transformed everyday greens into something hearty and memorable. Large collard leaves were blanched until pliable, then filled with a mixture of rice, onions, and small bits of pork or ham for seasoning. The rolls were tied or folded neatly, then simmered in broth until tender. This dish stretched small amounts of meat across many portions, making it economical yet satisfying. Housewives appreciated the recipe because collards were abundant and inexpensive, while rice added bulk and nutrition. Children sometimes resisted the leafy greens, but usually enjoyed the savory rice filling inside. Adults admired the way this meal turned familiar garden produce into something that felt both substantial and comforting. Stuffed collard rolls reflected both thrift and creativity, carrying influences from African, Southern, and even immigrant cooking traditions. Today, they are seldom seen, but at one time, stuffed collard rolls were a proud symbol of resourcefulness in African American lunch tables. Okra rice fritters turned leftover grains into a crisp and savory snack that doubled as a full lunch when paired with a simple salad. Cooked rice was mixed with chopped fresh okra, diced onions, and a pinch of cayenne before being shaped into small patties. The mixture sizzled in hot oil until each fritter formed a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and slightly sticky. The okra's natural thickening power bound the ingredients together without needing extra eggs or flour. These fritters were a clever way to use what was already in the pantry, making them perfect for busy families and thrifty cooks alike. Served hot with a spoonful of pepper vinegar or a dab of mustard, they carried a satisfying bite that made even a small plate feel abundant. In the 1970s, they were common in kitchens where nothing was wasted, and every meal was a chance to turn simplicity into flavor. Each fritter proved that leftovers could shine brighter than the first meal. Barbecue turkey. Neck po' boys were the sort of sandwich that could turn a quiet afternoon into a neighborhood event. Turkey necks were slow-cooked over low heat until the meat. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the meal that proved nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. After cooking meat, mothers saved the browned bits and leftover grease from the bottom of the skillet. With a bit of flour, water, and patient stirring, those drippings transformed into a smooth, savory gravy that tasted like far more than it cost. Poured over fresh rice, the gravy turned a plain bowl into a full dinner that kept children satisfied for hours. The smell of the gravy thickening was enough to bring everyone to the table early. Some nights, mothers added onions or a pinch of seasoning if they had it, deepening the flavor even more. Other nights, it was nothing but drippings and water, yet still tasted like comfort. Children learned early that gravy night meant nobody would go hungry. It was simple, filling, and reliable, the kind of meal that made hard days feel a little easier. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the quiet hero of many 1960s kitchens. Charcoal grilled pork steak delivered the rich, smoky flavor of outdoor cooking to an everyday lunch. Shoulder cuts of pork, more marbled and affordable than loin, were marinated in vinegar, garlic, and a blend of garden herbs before meeting a bed of glowing hardwood coals. The slow grilling allowed fat to render and smoke to infuse every bite with a deep, rustic aroma. Families often gathered outside around makeshift pits, turning the act of cooking into a midday celebration where neighbors shared stories while the meat sizzled. The result was tender slices with crisp edges and a flavor that could never come from an indoor stove. Grandparents remember these cookouts as community events where everyone brought a side dish, from collard greens to cornbread, creating a table that felt endless. The taste of that smoky pork remains a powerful reminder of summer afternoons, family togetherness, and the simple joy of good food prepared over an open flame. Spicy mustard. Greens, flatbreads gave weekday lunches a burst of heat and a hint of smoky bitterness that only well-cooked greens can provide. Dough was mixed and rolled thin before being pan-griddled until small brown spots appeared, filling the kitchen with the aroma of warm wheat. Meanwhile, mustard greens were sautéed with garlic, onion, and crushed red pepper until tender but still vibrant in color. The greens were then tucked inside the flatbread and folded into a neat pocket that could be eaten on the move without a plate or utensils. These flatbreads were especially popular with workers needing a quick meal that traveled well, and families often made extra to freeze for busy days. In the 1970s, they appeared at community fairs and church gatherings where the smell of sizzling bread and spicy greens drew long lines. Each bite carried the bold flavor of southern fields and the resourcefulness of cooks who knew how to turn simple garden harvests into unforgettable lunches that satisfied hunger and sparked conversation alike. Cane syrup over cold biscuits was a lunch that turned leftovers into comfort. Biscuits left from breakfast would be split open and covered with thick cane syrup, soaking into the bread until sweet and sticky. It was quick, inexpensive, and satisfying, requiring nothing more than what was already on hand. Housewives appreciated this because it wasted nothing, stretching food into another meal without extra cost. Children loved it because the syrup turned plain bread into a treat, while adults valued the energy it gave when paired with coffee or milk. Cane syrup was widely available in the South, making it a natural companion to biscuits that might otherwise go stale. The dish was simple, but it represented practicality, turning scraps into nourishment. Though it might seem plain now, cane syrup over cold biscuits was once a beloved quick meal, a reminder that even leftovers could carry sweetness and comfort during hard times. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the meal that filled bellies and hearts at once. Dry beans soaked overnight came to life in a pot of simmering ham hocks, onions, and bay leaves. The smoky aroma wrapped around every corner of the house, promising satisfaction long before the first spoonful. Served with a wedge of hot cornbread, it was food that stayed with you through the longest day. This dish didn't belong to luxury. It belonged to the hard-working, the faithful, and the patient. Every bean was soft, every bite of ham rich with flavor earned over hours. It was a dish made with time and trust, proof that good things waited for those who tended the pot. Families gathered around small tables with big appetites, passing cornbread and gratitude in equal measure. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the taste of sustenance, soul, and the art of stretching little into plenty. Boiled okra and rice bowls were one of the simplest midday meals, stripped down to nothing but essentials. Fresh okra pods were boiled until soft, then spooned generously over hot rice with a little salt and sometimes a splash of hot sauce or vinegar. The texture was slippery and not to everyone's taste, but the dish filled stomachs when little else was available. Housewives leaned on it because okra and rice were cheap and easy to prepare quickly, making it a dependable option when other ingredients were scarce. Children sometimes turned their noses up at the sliminess, but many grew up with it as a familiar part of daily life. Adults appreciated the steady nourishment and the ease of cooking something so simple. Though plain compared to other lunches, boiled okra and rice represented survival and thrift, proving that even the most basic foods could sustain families through lean times. Today it is nearly forgotten, but once it was a staple. Red beans and rice with andouille filled kitchens with a slow, simmered aroma that promised comfort long before lunchtime arrived. Dry red beans soaked overnight were cooked with onions, celery, and bell peppers known as the Holy Trinity of Creole cooking. Spicy andouille sausage lent a deep, smoky flavor that seasoned every grain of rice beneath the beans. Families often set a pot to cook in the morning so it would be ready when school and work breaks came, and the meal could easily stretch to feed whoever showed up hungry. In the 1970s, this dish served as a weekly ritual, often enjoyed on Mondays when leftovers from Sunday's dinner found new life in the pot. Served with a wedge of cornbread, it carried the traditions of Louisiana into kitchens from Chicago to Houston. Its balance of spice, warmth, and steady nourishment made it more than a meal. It was a shared experience of culture and community that everyone wanted back. Molasses-glazed sweet potato wedges offered a gentle sweetness that brightened even the most ordinary midday meal. Fresh sweet potatoes were sliced into thick wedges, brushed with sorghum or dark molasses, and roasted until the natural sugars caramelized into a sticky glaze. A pinch of cinnamon and a splash of apple cider vinegar balanced the rich sweetness with a subtle tang, filling the kitchen with a warm autumn aroma. Families prized this dish because it required little more than a backyard harvest of potatoes and a jar of pantry syrup, yet tasted indulgent enough for Sunday gatherings. Grandparents recall how the edges crisped to a delicate chew while the centers stayed soft and almost creamy, making each bite a small celebration. These wedges were often paired with fried chicken or simply served alongside a bowl of beans and greens, adding both color and comfort to the plate. Even today, the memory of that molasses shine and the slow roasting smell can bring a wave of nostalgia to anyone who grew up with Southern kitchens. Black-eyed pea soup was one of the most dependable winter meals because peas were cheap, nutritious, and able to stretch across multiple days. Mothers cooked them slowly with onions, seasoning, and scraps of bone or fat to deepen the flavor. As the peas broke down, the soup thickened into something hearty enough to anchor a dinner. Children gathered around the table with cornbread ready to dunk into their bowls. The soup warmed cold hands and filled hungry stomachs, offering comfort in every spoonful. Some families added rice to stretch it even further, turning one pot into several meals. The longer it simmered, the more the flavors blended together. Black-eyed pea soup did more than feed a family. It kept hope alive on the hardest days. Black-eyed pea soup was survival on the stove, steady and reassuring. Catfish nuggets with corn relish turned community festivals into a feast of golden bites that everyone wanted to sample. Fresh catfish was cut into small chunks, seasoned with black pepper and a hint of cayenne, then dredged in cornmeal before a quick fry in hot oil. The nuggets came out crisp on the outside and tender inside, easy to eat with fingers while wandering through crowded fairgrounds. A bright corn relish made from sweet kernels, diced peppers, and a splash of cider vinegar offered a cool contrast to the hot fish. Vendors served the nuggets in paper trays lined with newspaper so the juices would soak in without making a mess. In the 1970s, these little pieces of fish were the highlight of summer gatherings across the South and Midwest, where the smell of frying catfish traveled down streets and drew neighbors from blocks away. They were inexpensive, full of flavor, and perfect for sharing, which made them more than just a snack. They became a social event all by themselves. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was a Southern adaptation of African recipes that carried both thrift and flavor. Peanuts were ground into a paste or simmered with broth, then combined with chunks of sweet potato to create a thick, hearty stew. The dish was rich, slightly sweet, and deeply satisfying, making it a popular choice when meat was scarce. Housewives liked it because peanuts were cheap and abundant, while sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil, ensuring both ingredients were accessible to nearly everyone. Children enjoyed the creamy texture and natural sweetness, while adults valued the nourishing balance of protein and starch. It reflected African roots adapted to American kitchens, showing how cultural memory survived in food. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was more than a meal. It was a link between past and present, carried in every bowl. Though it has faded from everyday lunches, it once represented resilience, thrift, and heritage on Southern tables. Leftover hog maw and rice was a dish born from respect for labor, for food, and for the life that gave it. Hog maw, the lining of the pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, boiled slowly, and seasoned with onion, garlic, and pepper until tender. Nothing was wasted. Everything was used. Mixed with rice, the rich broth clung to every grain, turning scraps into comfort. It was the kind of lunch that filled the body and quieted the mind. Grandparents remembered standing over steaming pots, watching the meat soften while stories and laughter drifted through the kitchen. Hog maw and rice tasted of thrift and pride, of making do but never settling for less. Served cold the next day in tin pails or wrapped in foil, it still carried its same warmth. Every bite told the story of a people who refused to let hunger or hardship dull their flavor for life. Leftover hog maw and rice was history you could taste, humble, hearty, and full of grace. Pokeweed greens with cornbread were a survival lunch that carried caution as well as nourishment. Young pokeweed shoots, carefully harvested before they grew toxic, were boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness and danger. Once tender, They were seasoned lightly and served alongside cornbread for a meal that was simple yet filling. Foraging pokeweed required knowledge passed through families, since picking it at the wrong stage could be harmful. Housewives valued it because it was free food gathered from the land, while cornbread turned it into a complete meal. Children rarely enjoyed the bitter taste, but adults accepted it as a dependable option when money or supplies were scarce. It was a dish that spoke to resilience and the close relationship between people and the land. Today, pokeweed greens are largely forgotten, but once they were an important reminder that survival often meant making the most of what nature provided, even when risky. Pickled beet and egg salad added bright color to lunch tables and carried a sweet tang that lingered pleasantly on the tongue. Hard-boiled eggs were sliced and combined with sliced beets that had been pickled in vinegar, sugar, and a touch of clove until they turned a deep crimson hue. The eggs absorbed the rosy brine, creating a marbled effect that made every slice look like a work of art. A light dressing of mayonnaise and mustard balanced the acidity and gave the salad a creamy texture that paired well with simple sandwiches or crusty bread. In the 1970s, this dish appeared frequently in school cafeterias and church suppers, where its jewel-toned presentation caught every eye. It was economical, nourishing, and striking enough to feel festive without requiring expensive ingredients. Children often remembered the way the beets stained their fingers, a small sign that they had enjoyed something both playful and wholesome. This salad proved that everyday lunches could still deliver a touch of elegance and lasting flavor. Smothered pork chop biscuits combined two beloved Southern comforts into a handheld meal that satisfied even the hungriest midday appetite. Pork chops were seasoned with black pepper, dredged in flour, and pan-fried until the crust turned golden. A quick gravy made from the pan drippings, milk, and a pinch of sage was poured over the chops before they were tucked inside warm, flaky biscuits. The gravy soaked into the bread while keeping the meat tender and juicy, creating a sandwich that tasted like Sunday dinner in portable form. Families often made these in the morning and wrapped them in foil so the biscuits would stay soft until lunchtime. In the 1970s, they were a favorite at roadside diners and church bake sales where the smell of sizzling pork lured people in from blocks away. Each bite offered a harmony of buttery biscuit, savory gravy, and hearty pork that felt both indulgent and perfectly familiar, a reminder of the kitchens where love and practicality met on every plate. Okra gumbo with turkey andouille proved that deep flavor did not require heavy cuts of pork or seafood to shine. A dark roux began the process, stirred patiently until it reached a rich chocolate hue that promised depth and warmth. Sliced turkey sausage added a gentle smokiness, while fresh okra thickened the stew and gave it a silken texture that clung to every grain of rice. Onions, bell peppers, and celery formed the holy trinity of Creole cooking, releasing their fragrance as the pot simmered slowly over a low flame. This lighter lunch allowed families to stretch limited ingredients while still enjoying the unmistakable taste of Louisiana gumbo. Grandparents remembered gathering around bowls of this hearty dish during cool afternoons, the steam rising as conversation filled the kitchen. Served with a hunk of cornbread or ladled over plain rice, it nourished body and spirit alike. The memory of that deep brown roux and gentle spice remains a treasured flavor of coastal African American heritage, even when it no longer appears on everyday menus. Smothered chicken backs were one of the cheapest ways to turn poultry into a family dinner. Backs had little meat but plenty of flavor, and mothers knew exactly how to coax that flavor into a rich pot of gravy. After browning the backs in a skillet, they sprinkled flour to build a roux, then added water or broth until it thickened. The backs simmered until tender, releasing every bit of taste into the gravy. Served over rice, the result was comforting and hearty despite the humble ingredients. Children rarely noticed that the pieces were scraps. They only knew it tasted good. Mothers loved this dish because it stretched one small purchase into a whole pot of food that could carry a family through the evening. The gravy soaked into the rice perfectly, making every bite feel warm and satisfying. Smothered chicken backs were creativity at its finest, turning what others ignored into something worth gathering around.
If a single one of these lunches reminded you of a tin pail in your own family, then this list has done what it came to do. Our ancestors who packed these meals were not famous, and they were not thanked. Their hands fed our steel mills, our cotton fields, our Pullman cars, and our segregated schoolyards, one small pail at a time. So tell us in the comments which lunch your people carried, who packed it, and what city they were carrying it through. And if you want to sit at this table a little longer, we have a video on Black Sunday suppers from the same era waiting for you next.